think we've all seen the mug. How I just want to see if attribution is fake. Is it fake news? Do people here, have you seen attribution actually work for clients or yourselves if you're at a company? If we could see a show of hands, who's seen attribution actually work for people? Look at that. Okay, so I would love to ask when people started first experimenting with multi-touch attribution. So Andy, let's start with you.
So my first foray into attribution would have been back in 2013.
Maybe a winner.
Yeah, we had, I think it was Insight Squared way back in the day when it was attribution. It was all off the campaign, pretty basic, pretty straight-laced, but really useful in helping us determine what had worked, what hadn't. Obviously, by today's standards, it was not very robust, but it was revolutionary at the time.
Awesome. Anna?
So I actually was introduced into the world of multi-touch attribution back in, I think, 2016, where we were trying to create that kind of multi-touch system in Marketo itself, but it was solely based off of lead source. So it was first touch and last touch. So at the time, there weren't that many tools. So that's kind of how you had to hack the system to kind of make it work for you. So that was kind of my first foray into attribution.
Brooke, how about you?
Yeah, my first foray into attribution was probably when I was still in-house. 2 roles ago, we did a little bit in the way of first touch and last touch, but truly multi-touch came when I was in consulting at my previous role. And that's where I had the opportunity to work with clients who had things like Visible and some of these other platforms that really started to kind of build that out for me. So I would say probably 2018, 2019 is when I started to get a bit deeper into all of that. And then actually building things out for clients to support those types of platforms.
Carrie?
I would kind of say, I guess we all came to attribution around the same time, but I think for anybody who's tuning in today thinking that you're going to have like an add-on technology, those things really help, but all of us have done it. Like I did it with Excel and Marketo using first touch and last touch fields. And what was great about it, it was much more black and white. So it may not have been as accurate about assessing the whole journey, but we didn't have as many questions either. So because it was like first touch is first touch, last touch is last touch, and we knew what it was. So we did it all exporting data out of Salesforce and Marketo and putting it into Excel. We did it month over month, and we charted it for a year and a half or 2 to the point that we could pretty easily assess where to invest money to get a better return. So I think I actually maybe sometimes like that way better than trying to manage all the really deep tech stuff that we do now, but that's just me.
Pivot tables are a marketer's best friend.
Yes.
I would say a day I get to do a pivot table is a good day. And if you throw in a VLOOKUP, I'm real excited. So.
Oh, and the new XLOOKUP. I know people are just crazy about it. So I believe I started in 2015. We were one of Full Circle's first clients. But it was interesting because the big issue we had was selling it to the executive team. And I think that's where a lot of attribution projects really, they fail before they even start. So before we get into why attribution has failed so many marketers, because I know we all have a lot of insights that we can add to this conversation, let's talk about major changes we've seen in the market since we first started. So I'm going to let whoever jump in, and then I'll make sure to call on different people so everybody has a chance to talk.
I think the array of tools that have come out over the past few years, I know Full Circle was probably one of the original ones attached directly to the campaign. And then you see Visible that's attached to the campaign object. And so tools have kind of come full circle, knock on wood for that, for lack of a better term, where you can actually just attach it to your system. And I think that's probably a huge growth area of attribution in general, is being able to attach it to multiple systems at once to kind of pull data together.
Totally
Yeah.
agree.
I
Anyone
think
else?
that's, well, I was going to say, I think that that's probably like the biggest change, that if you look at the marketplace, no more is it just Salesforce is the system of truth or Marketo is the marketing system of truth. Even smaller companies are doing like data lakes and, moving data around. And so when you start doing that, you really have to look for tools that are a lot more flexible, and you have to understand your data a lot better, because you're no longer just looking at one system. You're usually looking at 6 systems. And so that's been a huge change from attribution and marketing and chat. Everything that we do has changed.
100%.
Yeah, to echo that, I was going to say data lakes and data warehouses. And then also being able to look at attribution across an entire account, as opposed to just individualized to a leader contact.
Right. And account, Brooke, I know you meant this, but I just wanted to dig in a little more and clarify. You mean not only the account and contacts associated, but auto matching leads and incorporating that data as well?
Exactly. So it's no longer just who has a role on the opportunity. It's, the lead to account matching, it's engagement across the account over time, and being able to look back a little bit more historically.
Mm-hmm.
That I think has been the biggest evolution, as opposed to just looking at an individual on a campaign with an opportunity as the full stop. There's so much more to it.
Yeah.
Andy?
I think in addition to that, the evolution has really been around people expanding what they expect to see from attribution as a result of the data that can be harvested.
Yeah.
In the early days of attribution, first touch was actually lead creation. It was based on the first campaign. It was harvested via CRM. There was no information associated unless you were doing advanced UTM tracking and what actually drove them to that webinar or that white paper or what have you. And the conversation changed when cookies started coming into play and all this potential anonymous data came in. It made everything so much more robust, but it also made it that much more confusing. Trying to explain to an executive why I potentially have data around 1 million individuals who have visited the website, but can only see 20% of them because those are the people that have filled out a form. Even something at that level can become, depending on how you're having that conversation, with whom, what their level of expertise is, and how it's framed, very confusing.
Great.
So, want to know what the rest of the data is, right?
Yeah, that's a can of worms. So I see some comments in chat. Thank you. I see some raised hands too. We will be monitoring chat. So folks who want to contribute, please go ahead and put stuff in there. So I'm going to go ahead and say, Katie Shea, in consulting roles, I had the opportunity to use a better tech stack with some companies, but from the start, we use campaign codes across channels, using query strings to monitor engagement and to rank score leads who are driving deeper into the funnel and purchasing. That sounds really complex. Congratulations for being able to untangle all of that. That's amazing. In 2018, I was able to work with a company that was using Path Factory to see which content was most often touched among purchasers and did it make a difference in conversion. So web loggers, Path Factory, things along those lines really do help content marketers in particular understand what to do. So that's a great point. And then we had a comment about, in order to have more accurate attribution, sales reps should be trained properly. And examples when a sales rep attaches a wrong account to an opportunity. I'm going to interject an opinion here. So wrong account to an opportunity, absolutely. Like we don't want that happening. But I think the best systems out there are passive and don't require salespersons to think about what they're doing. Does the panel agree with that, or do you have other opinions?
Yeah, safety proof everything. If you're relying on human input, you will have false data. We all make mistakes. We do the wrong thing. We forget. It's a recipe for inaccuracy.
Yeah. So I'm going to push a poll out there, or remind people to, let's launch it. So we've got 3 questions. And I didn't do that on purpose. I meant to do one question, but as we've seen from the very start of this, it's the first time we've used Zoom webinar. But I would love for people to answer the questions as we move on to our next question, which is the meat of why we are here. I would love to hear. So we've all seen things work for people. We've also seen it fail epically, or at least I have. What are the key contributing factors this panel has seen that has made it so many marketers have experienced attribution failure?
Data.
Well, yeah, 100%. Lack of data structure, or, not collecting the correct metadata. I think that's, on the campaign at least, or something, you kind of have to know where your campaigns are coming from. So yeah, I totally agree with you, Brooke.
I think there's also like a conceptual thing that I've noticed. I was lucky as a consultant to help a lot of people on board with Visible, but this is true about all attribution tools. So product agnostic is that people think they want marketing attribution, but what they think they're getting and what it actually is a lot different. And so I think people think attribution is going to give this black and white answer. And I always say, like, marketing reporting should be black and white. It should be like number of leads, revenue, all those things are pretty easy to consolidate and you can drill down. Attribution adds a level of art to it. And so as soon as you start expecting these reports or these models to provide reporting level data, I see a lot of marketing teams end up chasing perfect reports because that's what their CMOs are asking for, the CFO is asking for, and not really understanding, like, it takes a mental shift to go, this is an art. It's applying some assumptions, and we have to have the assumptions to track ROI, but it's certainly not black and white, and it never will be. It looks black and white because it's in a table and you can graph it, but it's an art.
Kind of tied to that is, I think we've talked about this before, Kamala, is resourcing and a lack of resourcing for attribution tools, especially in marketing ops in general. Sometimes, marketing ops doesn't get the correct amount of resourcing that they really actually need to keep things running. I do more fixes to original implementations than I do actual implementations where the tool has just sat there for a year. And it's almost like kind of tied to what Carrie says, where, they get this tool and they're expecting something, and then it's actually a lot of work to keep it up and make sure that, you're making sure that your spend data is accurate. So you can tie it to revenue. It's, collecting data how you expect it to. And so I think resourcing actually is a huge downfall to attribution because it almost requires a full-time resource in and of itself.
Yeah. And it is an art. So there are things, even with the most comprehensive tool out there that integrates with everything and takes in all of your data points and incorporates sales and channel data, you're still going to run into the issue no matter what you do. Word of mouth is so important for marketing. We do a lot of offline awareness. So like our podcast, the Revenue Marketing Report, there's no perfect way to track. And thank God we don't have the chip we can put in everybody's brain to see where they're coming from, because that's just, that's not okay. But I saw some really awful advice. One of our sales reps forwarded me something that said, if you can't track it, you shouldn't be doing it in marketing. So I think that speaks to one of the points, Andy, I think you and I had a conversation about this, where leadership buy-in is definitely part of the problem. Andy, would you like to speak more about that?
Sure. I think from the point at which attribution became an option and marketing started moving away from being a cost center to a revenue producer, we requested as marketers a seat at that table. But now the level of accountability is perhaps aligned against what's perceived can be reported on rather than what can actually be reported on. And so the KPIs, I think, need to be adjusted and level set with leadership before embarking upon this, or you will fail. If you have KPIs that you cannot deliver on, it's not going to be successful right out the gate. Doesn't matter what tool you use, doesn't matter how much support you have for it. Doesn't matter, how well it's implemented, what the data backing it up looks like. That is the first step in my mind, and one of the reasons that I think it's often difficult with leadership when it comes to attribution, above and beyond, of course, just getting them to level set on what it is.
And speaking to Anna's point of resources, having an analyst who can set the right expectations and communicate this to the executive team in a way that's palatable is so critical. And then understanding when to use which models, which is one of the questions we had. What attribution models do you prefer for different marketing programs? We all probably have opinions here. I'm going to round robin it. So Andy, let's start with you.
I am always a fan of the fact that the reason there are so many models is that different models answer different questions. And so depending on the question that you're asking, you need to use a different model to answer that. And it's not necessarily about programs per se, although if you're trying to understand how top of funnel content is performing, you may want to look at a U or a W, right, to understand early funnel impact. But you probably want to look at where it's hitting on the funnel anyway. You might be creating what you think is top of funnel content, and it's not.
Yeah, 100%. Carrie?
When someone's like, which one do I use? I was like, you have to use them all. Great answer. They're super excited with that. But I think if I can narrow it down to two, what I often tell them is to go to a U-shaped. I think U-shaped is the best because it splits the credit between first touch and lead creation. And if there were ever two that should be split evenly, I feel like that's the best one because they're both equally as important, right? The first time a person discovered you versus the first time they chose to give you their name. So I think that's really important for top of funnel and demand gen teams. So where are your people coming from? But then I like a full path model or an even split when I look at revenue, because I think it's really hard. You can do things where you narrow down and say which content or which channel is driving the most MQLs or SALs, but those are real moments in time. Mm-hmm. And over time, you really want to kind of level it out and let influence be a part of it. So the channels and the content, if you look at it through the life of the opportunity across all your opportunities or across all that are in a certain category, you get the best information on how your efforts are playing into revenue.
And I think with more advanced tools, sometimes with content marketers, you actually want to look at engagement and attribution because you can tag those passive activities through your web logger, incorporate that into your model, and actually get a better picture. Anna?
When I have a client that's pretty new to attribution in general, I try to kind of say, look at the models and explain it in a way of thinking which team within your marketing org would benefit from this model. So for example, a demand gen team is likely going to benefit from first touch and lead creation because that's where their spend is likely focused. And then when you get into, the other types of models, that's more for, maybe the marketing ops team to kind of look at to see, okay, is everything working as we expect it? And then when it gets to sales, when they're trying to look at revenue in particular, what's driving opportunities, that's kind of where you need to get into more of a full path to understand the full picture of things. So I kind of like to explain it as it's team-based as well. So, if you're on marketing ops, you might not find first touch and lead creation as exciting or as necessary, but there are teams within the marketing org that do need that crucial information for their programs.
Great. Brooke?
I mean, I would agree with everything that's been said here. It really comes down to what are the questions that you're trying to answer? What are the goals? And what are the teams that you're answering that for? I worked a lot with demand gen and lead gen teams in my previous role. I actually sat within the demand gen team as a consultant. So I did have a big focus on that, what was bringing those people in. But I think too, as you look toward the end, there's also two divergent paths that you have, which are those people who are engaged but haven't raised their hand. And then you also have the hand raisers as well. And so I think there's an element of that too, is what's getting people across the line and what's getting them almost there. And that's information that can go back to that demand gen team or your content teams or even your SDRs to provide those insights of, what's getting them there or what what can we do more of to get more of those people across the line? And that's kind of where that full path story starts to come into play, and looking at that across also things like verticals and industry and buyer persona. There's a ton of different layers that you can start to build on that really make this, more robust and less clean cut than an Excel spreadsheet was. But really help to answer those questions across the entire funnel and across the entire organization.
Great answer. So we had a question that I just have to throw out there. Since most attribution tools only touch marketing engagement, it often conflicts with sales data. What's the best way to manage that? So one is get a tool that incorporates sales data, but two, let's talk about marketing's C word, credit. So I hear this used a lot, and it's like a bomb that's just waiting to go off. Let's talk about this. Brooke, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think that's a really hard piece of this. When you start to talk about credit, absolutely marketing wants to be held to the commitments that they've made, wants to be accountable for the dollars that are spent. But when you really start to divide it up into credit, a lot of times that might come off as it's a hard thing for sales to swallow, especially if sales is compensated for bringing in pipeline or closing or revenue. And then marketing seems like they're trying to come in and say, well, hey, wait a minute, that was us. You come off as potentially trying to take money out of people's pockets, and you're immediately going to get pushback. You're going to get friction. There'll start to be bad blood. You're not going to get the kind of alignment that you're looking for. Instead of looking at this as marketing's opportunity to help sales do their job better and support them. And so a lot of it is the phrasing and the mentality. I actually just saw Jeff pop that up in the chat as a trigger word, and it's exactly that. It immediately puts up walls and puts up defenses. So I think find any opportunity to phrase it in a different way than credit, because that's going to be a non-starter for a lot of sales leaders and sales reps.
And I love what you were saying around positioning, because I think success and failure hinges so much on how we position this tool and how we're going to use it. So I think that's a great point. Anna?
I mean, Brooke said it very well. I mean, I completely agree with what she said.
She really nailed it.
I think, and I've seen this when I was in-house, the sales team and the marketing team constantly fighting over who's getting credit. Oh, sales isn't following the process so that they get credit. And it just creates such a toxic environment in terms of, let's just look at the opportunities and see, like, we're working together essentially. So let's just look at it that way. So yeah, I couldn't have said it better.
Well, and let's talk about what attribution isn't going to solve. It's not going to solve a toxic relationship between your sales VP and your CMO. It's only going to make it worse unless you position it as a marketing tool. Does anyone else want to jump in there? Yes, Carrie, go.
So many thoughts.
I love it.
I feel like credit drives me nuts. And the other phrase I hear is like, we want to prove marketing's contribution to revenue. And it's like, what a terrible way to position this, because at the end of the day, attribution is a tool that you should be using to be I would say, like, maybe we swap credit with responsibility. Because the idea here is not that we're taking credit for bringing in the leads or bringing in the engagement. We have a responsibility to be spending the company's money wisely or our time wisely. And so the whole point of doing attribution to me is to make better decisions. So attribution is not something you do and then stop and like look back and be like, look at how good we did in Q1. You should be like, what did we do in Q1? All right, let's assess it and let's see what can we do differently in Q2 with what we learned from Q1 to like bring in better leads, to accelerate the pipeline. Like, we could not be more on the same team with sales. And so I think just drop the word credit from your vocabulary, prove marketing's contribution, and start saying, like, we want this tool so that we can understand which of our activities is driving the right people at the right time to salespeople. And then if you can get that out of the way, it's a win for sales. And ultimately, we all have one metric we have to work towards, which is revenue. Pipeline doesn't even matter, right? Like, it's revenue. What did we close? And so if you can show the entire org that what you're doing is impacting revenue, the rest kind of takes care of itself. But it does take a lot of saying that in the right way and living it as well.
I mean, I think every marketer would agree that marketing today is nothing like it was 2 years ago. I mean, how many people saw their field event and trade show budget completely disappear and then be told everything needs to be digital without changing the budget? Like, most of us saw that, right? It was amazing. Andy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. So two things here. One, the way that I tend to position this, particularly with clients, is thinking about it as investment optimization. If I were managing a portfolio of stocks for you and you had several underperformers, at the end of the quarter, I would report that to you and you would reallocate funds. This is exactly the same thing. It's just marketing dollars, right? Beyond that, I think as organizations are starting to shift more and more toward a revenue ops focus, as opposed to marketing versus sales, that's helping a little bit. But I think the organizations that do the best with this do take into account sales contributions as well. And so the investment becomes not marketing's investment, but the business investment that yielded revenue. And if you pivot the conversation in that direction, it's not about how marketing performed or sales performed. It's not a, we passed you all these great MQLs and you didn't close them. It's suddenly about, this is how the business is performing. Yes. And this crucial part of the business, which keeps us all working, has to function well. And if we're not tuning it and making sure that it's running smoothly as a machine, then we are doing the business a disservice.
Mic drop. That was amazing. Okay, so while I'm lining up the next question, I want to share the poll really quickly. See if I can do that well. Okay, so have you tried marketing attribution? And I don't think any of us are going to be surprised by the answer. It looks like yes, but I didn't trust it as a big one. And that's understandable. We all know bolting a tool onto our platform as is extremely problematic. Garbage in, garbage out. In terms of, do you currently have a marketing automation tool? I love to see that a good chunk is yes, and we love it. Yay. And then I'm seeing we can't get the budget. Yep. Other execs don't trust it. I'm guessing the C word may be playing a part in that. And we use it quarterly scares me, because if you're not using attribution to make decisions about what you're doing today, you're not leveraging it to its full potential. So biggest barrier, data hygiene, not a surprise, not enough resources. It seems too complicated. It is hard to get everybody on board, and poor map or CRM adoption. So did we see any big surprises there, folks? No, not really. Okay, so the question I do want to address as a team is, did you see a large difference between the different models when comparing with a linear one? I'm going to say yes, but we'll get to why. Is linear good enough for influence for most low volume B2B sales touch points? I'm going to let whoever wants to tackle that first jump in.
I worked in-house at a B2B software company that had very long lead cycles and was like kind of a fixed market. So it was almost essentially ABM without intentionally being ABM, because we just knew the market really well. Yeah. I think when you have low volume, you may not have as much drama in the ups and downs, and you might have to apply a little bit more human insight. So it might be a lot more kind of analysis that is like, I want to use the word story, but because you're not going to have like the data analysis that you have as much fluctuation where you have a big sample size and you can trust that over time it's leveled out. You're going to have to like kind of look in and add some more judgment calls based on what you know about it. But I do think that especially with smaller B2Bs or like, where you have really large enterprise clients and you just have a smaller sample size, time becomes a lot more of your friend on that one. That if you can just give it time and kind of track it through, over time, it tends to level out to be intelligence. And then you've got to kind of like go with the idea of KPIs that treat them more like milestones along the way. Like they're not the be all end all. Like SAL isn't going to be like, let's just get them there. But you want to know, like, are we trending in the right direction with those milestones? And I think that that's how you kind of rectify it when you have a smaller audience.
And it really depends on what questions your marketing team is struggling to answer as well. A lot of us have seen a change in how social media advertising and paid search have been performing, which is really an earlier play. So have any of you seen that as well?
Yeah, I mean, for me, especially when I was at Walker Sands and sitting within the demand gen team, we did a lot in the way of paid search and social for our clients. And, as you mentioned, and how much marketing has changed really in the last, year and a half at this point, seeing how different spend was hitting or different audiences or where in the funnel it was changing and it was fluctuating. There was a lot where, what worked in 2018, 2019, where it was really that lead generation piece. Yeah. All of a sudden those ads were hitting much deeper into the funnel, trying to get in front of those people. And that really changed how we looked at ad spend, because we all of a sudden saw this big shift from lead creation to influence. And it had to change with that, the way we spoke to our clients about how their ad spend was working or influencing potential revenue and pipeline.
Does anyone want to add anything before I throw another question at you? Okay. So has anyone here used Octopost's attribution capabilities for social, and do we have an opinion about it? I've never used it.
I've not used the attribution piece. I've pushed Octopus data, engagement data into Marketo and used it to play into things, but
I know I think it can assign its own parameters to posts, if I'm not mistaken, but that's the extent of what I've seen it do.
It would be nice to incorporate whatever data it has into other existing models. I wouldn't trust it on its own. Let's see here.
Well, actually, on that subject, we were actually trying to, when I was in-house, actually take away the Octopus parameters so that it incorporated with the UTM parameters that we were developing as a company whole.
Mm-hmm. I think something really important about that question is that I think that for the most part, you have to have a real understanding of what data you're looking at and what you're trying to accomplish without concern for the tool. So like, if you really get into it, like the reason why we're looking at which channels work is we're making decisions about where do we spend money, which channels do we invest in. That's product agnostic, so it doesn't matter. So then you find the products that fit with your tech stack that answer those questions. But I think if any one tool is providing the data, you have to be very, I don't want to say skeptical about the data, but you really need to understand it because it should make sense across multiple platforms. It shouldn't be true in Octopus, but not true in Salesforce or not true in Marketo.
100%. So we have a really great question, but it's pretty in-depth. I would love to hear from the team how you define or choose which KPIs you're going to incorporate from attribution with your clients or companies. This is a tough one.
Yeah, it's very client dependent. So I've had clients that didn't care anything about pre-opportunity. So they didn't want to see any of the reporting pre-opportunity, which was crazy to me, but that's just what they preferred. So we focused a lot on, any kind of reporting that tied to opportunity creation and that kind of reporting. So I think, that question obviously can, vary company to company, and it's totally up to what their executive team, I think, is wanting to see at the end of the day as well.
But how do you navigate the conversation of, we want to see marketing contribution to pipeline and revenue? How do you tackle that with an executive team?
So I want to start with what the KPIs are from the very top leadership and see that trickle down. If it's not, then I know we're going to have a challenge right out the door. Once that's established, we look at which KPIs we can help report on with the data that we have, and what data is missing that needs to be created, if possible, to backfill the others, and go from there.
Great. And then I do want to circle back to revenue and pipeline contribution. That's a risky proposition to put in front of the executive team if you're not incorporating a ton of data points. And even then, it can be problematic. You're putting certain campaign tactics at risk if you adopt one model and present that as the single truth. Have any of you also found that, or do you have different recommendations?
I think that one of the places where I see people go wrong is that they treat attribution as something that should be reported up to the highest levels, where I view it as being like a very tactical type of marketing. So you should be using your attribution tools to make better marketing decisions, and they should have a downstream effect that impacts the reports that your executive team sees. Does your executive team, I think it kind of like ties into the KPI question. KPIs should be like kind of leading indicators. Like, are you on the right path? Especially if you have a long sales cycle. You can't wait for revenue to come in 9 to 12 months later. You have to have those KPIs, but you have to really make sure that you can explain what you're doing and how it's impacting the funnel and sales velocity and revenue, so that there's a level of trust that you don't have to be like, the last thing you want to do is be like, well, how come Google Ads gave us 72 MQLs in January and in February it was 70? And you're like, whoa, pump the brake. But it sounds silly, but we all have seen companies go down that path. And so you stop marketing and you start answering to the reports. And so the important thing to know is that this is a tool that needs to be managed and reviewed. And it should really, you need to be able to speak intelligently about how you are using this data to move forward and what you hope to gain. Like we reallocated 10% from this pile of money to that pile of money, and this is what we hope to see. We should know in 3 months if that was a good decision. If it was a good decision, we're going to do this. If it turns out it wasn't a great decision, we're going to roll that money back. And then they see that, number one, you have a responsibility. You have a plan, whether things go good or bad, and then it stops being about the MQL number itself and the process that you're implementing.
Which goes back to a great point that James made about, I think most marketers want the silver bullet to tell them what they need to do. How do you manage that expectation with teams that are trying to bring on attribution? Because I totally agree, it's not going to solve everything. We've said that over and over. And I know we've all talked about this. So who would like to jump in first?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I think, that's one thing. We talked about responsibility and marketing wanting to be accountable. I think the counterpoint to that is you're never going to be able to account for every single dollar that marketing spends. To try to do something like that, it would be like counting grains of sand on the beach with oven mitts. It's not going to work. There's always things that are going to fall through. And you also have to look at it through the lens of, what are you doing? There are other things, you mentioned a little bit with offline channels. There are branding activities that marketing is going to spend money on. And you're never going to get the same level of attribution out of that. If you put a billboard on the side of the expressway, or, maybe you've got some advertising spend that you put at a trade show or event. Maybe you're doing, podcasts and webinar recordings, and then you're putting them on YouTube. These are things that you're not going to be able to have UTM parameters and cookies and digital touch points, but they're still important. So there is that lens of the human view and understanding what all else is happening with marketing too that needs to be considered.
The reality is it's an art and a science, right? And we can get as much into the weeds on the numbers on the science part, but art is art because it's not fully quantifiable. And at the end of the day, if you have good artists, you need to let them do what they're doing, get out of their way. And I'm not sorry about it.
We need a t-shirt that says that.
Yeah, I like that.
There's a really good, I think we had this conversation, Camilla. There's a coffee shop in Seattle called the Lano's Coffee Roasters that had a poster that said, the art is in the roast. No, wait, the science is in the roasting. The art is in the repeating. And I was like, oh, boom. That's exactly what it is. Like the science isn't like figuring out what to do. And then the art's knowing, how do we roll this out in a scalable way?
Yeah. Yeah. And it has something also to do with executive maturity, because if we should be able to agree if sales is hitting their number, marketing is doing something right. Why can't we do that? It's one of the many mysteries. Okay, so I know we've been giving a ton of advice, answering questions. It's all been wonderful. One piece, I'm going to ask each of you one piece of advice you want to give people who are just thinking about acquiring an attribution tool.
There's so many pieces of advice. Make sure that you have a defined UTM structure before you get an attribution tool, just because from the digital side, that will help you drastically. I've had multiple clients that we've started an implementation and they tell me that they don't have a UTM parameter set up at all. And so we have to start from square one and kind of explain the importance of that. So I think thinking through, your channels and everything and how you want to attribute that in URL and UTM parameters is a good start.
Yeah, absolutely. Just think of all the early awareness search ad activity you're getting, and then they're clicking around the site instead of filling out the form you want them to. I mean, it's just so critical. Good point.
I think another piece there is long-term viability. You may or may not be able to afford the tool that you ultimately want at the time that you're implementing it. Yeah. But if you know you're going to need it in 6 months, in a year, and even 2 years, the pain of pulling out one tool and replacing it with another is not necessarily worth the effort, first. And secondly, you want to assess companies on how likely it is that they'll be not just in the market, but continuing to be a leader in the market for the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, however long you think you'll be using them. Because what you don't want is a tool that is maybe going to get stale or, not be maintained going forward. And then you're stuck with something that becomes sort of a relic, I guess. It's good to ask vendors, how are you planning on managing the transition with what's happening with cookies and anonymous data, and what does your roadmap look like for that? Those types of things are important to consider as you're selecting a vendor for anything, but I think attribution in particular.
Absolutely.
I go ahead, Brooke.
Yeah, I was going to add on a little bit to what Anna said about UTM parameters, but also to go with that, program and campaign membership.
Yes.
Because if you're not doing any of that, most attribution tools still have a reliance on campaign membership. And if you're not using the campaign object or not using it to its full potential, it's just like UTM information. There's no data there to be had or to report on. So I think putting those two pieces in place, whether you have an attribution tool yet or not, thinking about how these different things play into an attribution tool and starting to set yourself up for success before you're actually paying for one. Getting those things going is the first step prior even to a tool evaluation.
And as Jeff said, you want to be able to show results on a campaign level, which includes account engagement. Absolutely. Another t-shirt, nail the basics. It's just like any tool you get, there's going to be some work for sure. Carrie?
I would say think about what you will do with the data, because that often helps you structure the data. So if you don't have paid advertising, that may not be something you really need to worry about. So you really want to look at, like, we really focus on content management. Well, then you really want to make sure you don't just have like UTM campaign, you want UTM term, and you want this. So you really want to be thinking, what decisions can I make with this data, and what information would I need to make those decisions, so that you're constantly thinking, because the last thing you want is a tool that just kind of plugs on, you put a lot of work into implementing, and like Anna said, it sits for you don't do anything with. Like, I think it's pretty cool to get, I go on my clients' tools all the time just to see what's working. And I think you should kind of develop like this little love affair with your attribution tool to be like, oh, this is great. We thought this was going to work, or this failed miserably. Also, great information to have. And it's often very surprising. So I think, like, really think about how the tool can be giving you the information you need to do better marketing.
Okay, now I know we're getting close to time, but I want to throw this question out there because I think it's so important. For those who have an existing attribution implemented and it's not working for them, it's not adopted, where are the first places they should look to solve that problem? Carrie, why don't we start with you? We'll reverse it.
I think, like what you just said like a minute ago, it's got to be back to basics. So if you've got something that's not working, you may have overcomplicated it. You may not have the right data getting in. So I would say, like, set it down, let the dust settle, and kind of like step by step. Do we have UTMs? Do we have duplicates? Do we have this? And just piece by piece, kind of like walk through the basics of what you need to get it done. And then you can incorporate some of the bigger stuff.
Andy?
I mean, I think that covers it.
I know.
Way more. There's
I would add, like, how did you sell it? Are you using the C word? Have you had the right conversations with the executive team? Are you incorporating it into your daily processes to figure out if you're really optimizing against attribution, or if it's just something you're using in QBRs?
Yeah, I think it's also if you're using the data correctly in the sense of the way that you're viewing it.
Yes.
I know that there are a number of tools out there which have some really interesting and potentially pretty dashboards, but that's what they are. They're interesting. They're not necessarily decision driving or informative. And I find that often to get that data to tell me the actual output of dollars spent from more of a campaign or tactic perspective, that I do have to put that via, data warehousing into a BI tool and kind of pivot it in my own way and dissect the data slightly differently than the way that it was originally served up. Because while the way it was originally served up was interesting, it was looking at things from, let's say, a lead by lead perspective, or it was looking at things from a campaign by campaign perspective. But maybe I need to be able to see how, my channels and sub channels performed against my tactics, and I need to pivot those against each other. And the tool just doesn't provide that.
Yeah. Good points.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, the details and the basics, to go along with that, things like persisting UTMs. You talked about clicking around on a website, mm-hmm. or data that is existing on a lead when they're created. Is that carrying over on conversion to the contact? Or do you have a bunch of contacts that all of a sudden their source is salesforce.com and you're accounting for all of that and losing all of the pre-data? Just going through the motions of following that entire journey and seeing that every single one of those pieces are in place, I think is huge. And then a platform that can process the data that you have, yes. That's coming from multiple different places and different sources, and not, as we talked earlier, there are so many solutions that are integrated with everything. There really isn't, hey, this one platform is now the be all end all and everything happens here. There's so many other areas of information that can be of value. If you have something that can digest that and add to that story, you're just adding more color to your picture.
Anna, do you want to add anything?
I mean, they all covered it beautifully. So
yeah, they did a really good job.
It would just be
Okay.
repeating.
Yeah, I can't thank you all enough. Thank you so much for this discussion. Where can people find each of you online to network?
I guess I'll start. I'm most active on LinkedIn, somewhat present on Twitter, but if I'll be honest, I just don't have the time to dedicate to make it actually really interesting to follow me unless you want to know about other unrelated items. But on LinkedIn, you can find me, Andy Carone, and happy to connect with you. Love seeing new content from people.
Same here, LinkedIn for me, Anna Leary. That's where I'm most active. So feel free to connect with me there.
Likewise, Brooke Bartos on LinkedIn. My Twitter is also a bunch of random musings, but you'll occasionally find some marketing content up there. That one's at Chi-Town Brooke.
Great. Carrie?
Also LinkedIn, and don't be intimidated by the last name. It's really phonetic, Pickle Signer. So I think if you just type Carrie Pickle, like Mariah Carey Pickle, and then you'll get the spelling and you'll get a long road path. So, but I do it all on LinkedIn.